Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of the Standards for Professional Learning Kickoff Week. My name is Paul Fleming, and I'm the Senior Vice President for Standards, States, and Equity at Learning Forward. And on behalf of the entire Learning Forward team, I'm so excited to welcome all of you to this session called Getting to Know the Standards for Professional Learning. So we hope over the next hour that you will gain a deeper understanding of the newly revised Standards for Professional Learning through both an overview and new video about the standards, and by hearing from our 4 panelists who will share their insights and expertise on 4 different and highly relevant topics. These topics are equity, high quality curriculum and instructional materials, district strategic planning and learning designs, and school leadership. So we are so excited to have our 4 panelists today who will engage in this discussion after the overview. And these 4 panelists are Amy Colton, who is the Executive Director of Learning Forward Michigan, Eric Hirsch, who is the Executive Director of Ed Reports, Tara Isaacs, Director of Teaching and Learning for Jefferson County Public Schools, and Marlon Williams, Principal of Dr. Daniel Hale Williams Middle School, 180 in New York City, the Bronx. So we will engage with a discussion and invite some of your questions and comments during the panel discussion portion of our hour together. And now let's begin with an overview of the standards today by watching our new video.
When it comes to creating the best possible schooling experiences for our students, we know that professional learning for educators is an essential lever empowering all educators so that every student benefits. With that singular purpose in mind, Learning Forward developed the Standards for Professional Learning so that educators around the world have the latest knowledge and insights for designing, implementing, and sustaining high-quality professional learning. The standards generate a learning system in which high-quality professional learning leads to positive changes in educator knowledge, skills, and dispositions, which lead to improvements in educator practice, which in turn lead to accelerated student results. The standards are organized into a framework with 3 parts: content, processes, and conditions for professional learning. Standards within the rigorous content for each learner frame describe the essential content of adult learning that leads to improved student outcomes. Standards within the transformational processes frame describe process elements of learning, explaining how educators learn in ways that sustain significant changes in their knowledge, skills, practices, and mindsets. Standards within the conditions for success frame describe aspects of the context, structures, and cultures that undergird high-quality professional learning. Equity of opportunity and access to powerful learning for each educator and student is a driving force throughout the standards. When implemented, these standards lead to high-quality leading, teaching, and continuous improvement in schools. The kind of support educators experience in continuous learning environments contributes to greater educator satisfaction, retention, and efficacy. Since developing the first set of standards in 1994, Learning Forward has led their evolution with the help of hundreds of educators, leading organizations, foundations, and thought leaders in the education field. This ensures that the standards for professional learning will continue to meet the needs of students and educators for generations to come, preparing them to respond to the demands of an ever-changing world. Educators who work in environments driven by comprehensive professional learning systems have both the privilege and responsibility of leading the learning profession. With high-quality learning at the heart of schools, every student experiences the best possible teaching and support for their continued success. Visit Learning Forward to learn more about how to bring the standards for professional learning to your school or system.
Well, thank you. And I hope that this video that we're so excited to feature and premiere this week during the Standards Kickoff Week will be of great use to you and your teams and your schools and your systems going forward. So I want to kick off by showing the rest of the schedule for this week and hope that, one, you were able to join for part or whole of yesterday as we took the first look for Standards for Professional Learning, including some of the history and those that made the standards possible, including our Standards Advisory Council, which our panelists are part of and have played a huge role in the development of the revised standards. And then looking ahead for tomorrow, Thursday, and Friday, we're excited to share that there will be a congressional briefing on how the standards and policy move practice, and show and hear from educators and policymakers at both the district, state, and research levels to advance and intertwine policy and practice in this congressional hearing. Thursday will be a deeper dive into the role of the 4 leaders you see on the screen: the district office leader, the principal, the instructional coach, and the external partner, and how all levels of the system work together for implementation of the standards. And then on Friday, we will wrap up with the Research Foundation, including some exciting previews and findings from the meta-analysis we had from AIR. All this is taking place every day at 3 p.m. Eastern for just 1 hour. So we hope that you will join us, obviously not just for today, but for the rest of the week as your schedule allows. So we want to turn to a quick overview of the standards and the revised standards for all of you before we get to our panel today. And so we want to do that by sharing kind of a quick overview of what the standards will look like for implementation, and to give us some key highlights as well with the standards. And while we're waiting for that to be shown for the visuals of our standards, there we go. Thanks. What we're really excited about is this looks like a pretty simple visual, but as you see here with the 11 standards that are in the newly released standards for 2022, you will see a very intentional design of what we call the standards pie. Notice that all the standards are touching each other. Notice that the 3 frames are connected. And notice that the intent is, those of you that have used our previous versions of the standards, is that these work in concert to really advance and develop a high quality professional learning system. And we know that there are different entry points into the standards, but we also know that for effective use, these standards do need to be viewed as part of a system framework, and also a way to view them as working together to advance some of the important concepts that we'll touch upon today in the overview. So if we turn to the next slide, you will see, as you mentioned in the video, the 3 frames that we have here, starting with the rigorous content for each learner, right? This is really the what of professional learning. So when we talk about equity practices, we talk about curriculum assessment instruction, and we talk about deep content knowledge and professional expertise. We know this is the what for what drives the content for each learner, and each learner meaning not just for students, but for adult learners and educators as well in this first frame. That is followed on the following slide here, you'll see with the transformational processes. As you know, then this is really the how for professional learning and how it gets done. And so you'll see the bundling of the 4 standards with implementation, learning designs, evidence, and equity drivers working together so that educators can have significant and sustainable changes in their knowledge, skills, practices, and mindsets as well. And then finally, the 3rd frame, which conditions for success, are really the foundational conditions, right, that make a high quality professional learning system possible. As we know that these pieces, and you're going to hear this today from Principal Williams, right, the importance of leadership and how leadership and resources together have to work to get to work in connection so that every educator has access and opportunity and experiences high quality professional learning. You'll also hear is a highlight about the culture of collaborative inquiry, which is another standard in this frame for conditions for success, and the value of peer learning as well. So these 3 frames and the way that those standards are bundled form really the pie, the affectionately we would call the standards pie, without ever losing touch with each other, right? And to do that. So I want to also mention a couple key highlights. If you look at the next slide here for the foundations that really undergird the standards. And we won't read through all of these because there are 2 slides here, but I want to highlight the second one in particular around professional learning systems that drive high quality professional learning, right? We know ideally what has to happen, right? That high quality professional learning needs to be in the DNA of every school, every district, and every system, and every state, and that educators deserve this and actually should demand it from their leaders and from their systems. And that's what we mean by this systems approach. We can no longer be satisfied with pockets of excellence and educators feeling like they're doing this all on their own, but are getting the support and the tools necessary in order to be part of a high functioning and high quality professional learning system. And that's why we make this a foundational belief for the standards. Certainly along with equity and also high quality professional learning, improving practice and results. And then if you look at to continue with the foundations, I also want to highlight the second bullet here about the importance of how educators lead learning for self and others. We've seen this across the country, and all of you know this as well, the importance of peer learning and peer leadership. In fact, this is often an overlooked and undervalued professional learning strategy for peers to lead each other in high quality professional learning. And it's really the driving force for our standard on culture of collaborative inquiry that has an evidence base that better student outcomes occur through ongoing sustainable educator collaboration, which we know takes work. We also know, some pretty sobering statistics. Over half of all educators have never seen a colleague teach or visited their classroom. This is not the fault of educators, but this is what we mean by the opportunities that are there for educators to engage in collaborative inquiry towards a common goal. And so we're excited to share these foundations that you see here. And I just wanted to highlight those two as two that are powerful and particularly meaningful. In this overview, which is a lot to work, we're going to be covering a lot of ground here in these few minutes, but all of this will be available, as we'll mention, on our website, is also the research overview. And we know that these standards are informed not just by practitioners like who are on our advisory council and working groups, but also from our past versions of the standards and insights from the field, as well as from AIR, who conducted a literature review and meta-analysis. In fact, if you see on the next slide, the power of this research, that the meta-analysis from AIR reviewed 48 studies from 52 professional learning programs, right? And found that the standards for professional learning are associated with improved student instruction and student achievement outcomes, which we know is critically important to have an evidence base for advancing the field and for advancing the practices of all educators. So you'll be hearing a lot more, especially if you're able to tune in on Friday with my colleague Elizabeth Foster, who will be sharing all of these great highlights, as well as a panel of leading and cutting edge researchers who will be sharing their highlights and their insights as well about the standards. So let's dive in just for a moment before we get to our panel and talk a little bit about the standards and some of the, what we're calling almost in quotes, some of the newer standards. I want to make just a really short important point about the explicit and inclusive use of equity. You'll see that there are 3 equity standards, one for each frame, and that's by design. So there's not a standalone standard on equity that suggests maybe an isolated approach. And also equity is threaded throughout each standard with the common stem, in the language of the common stem, about equitable and excellent outcomes for all students. And that also, again, is by design, so that equity is, again, in the DNA of the standards for professional learning and should be in the DNA of every system in the practices of every educator as well. So on that notion, we do have the 3 new equity standards. Equity practices, which is in the frame for rigorous content, which has a very explicit student focus. And you see here the 3 constructs that are denoting and advancing the importance, right, of understanding students' background, their historical and cultural context, and also the importance of fostering relationships, not just with students, but with their families and the communities. That has a very explicit, again, student focus for the educator. Moving to the second equity standard with equity drivers, trying to show the importance of these 3 constructs, the evidence base for changes in educator practice, and how important prioritizing equity is for professional learning practices, identifying and addressing one's own biases and beliefs, and also the importance of collaborating with diverse colleagues to provide multiple perspectives. So this has the educator lens, and you'll be hearing more from this of how Amy Colton, specifically one of our panelists, is working with equity and working in networks that are promoting equity as well. And then finally, with the equity foundations, thinking on the systems level, right, about what are those key foundational elements like an equity vision and structures that actually ensure access to high quality professional learning for every educator are present and are embedded at the systems level. So through the 3 equity standards, you have the explicit focus on student needs and practices, educator needs and practices, and system needs and practices through the equity standards. Moving on to one of our other newer standards, you see here the curriculum assessment and instruction standard. You'll hear from panelist Eric Hirsch talk about the incredible importance of the need for high quality instructional materials and curriculum and the pairing of it with professional learning, especially when we know, think about, as we know, the average teacher nationwide is spending 8 to 12 hours a week searching for, developing, and implementing curriculum and instructional materials. This is time that should be used in the explicit sharing and focus on high quality instruction. And we know then the value of when teachers have use and access to high quality professional learning and instructional materials and curriculum, that time shifts towards greater instructional outcomes as well. And then finally, our newer one on the professional expertise. So the recognition that standards work in concert. And so, for example, if you are a principal, you are thinking about, right, how do I align these standards for professional learning with my own state or national leadership standards, like the PSEL standards, the professional standards for educational leaders, and especially around the focus of equity that are in the national leadership standards. And so the importance of the deep content expertise and the knowledge that educators at all levels need to align this work to other types of content and explicitly leadership standards as well. So that's a very quick overview of those standards, but we also wanted to show just briefly what's contained in each standard. So as I mentioned, there is a common stem that starts and has throughout the 11 standards. There are always 3 concepts or components that are included, and that's where the narrative follows the actual standard statement with the common stem. Third, there will be linkages with other standards to show, again, the connection and how the standards work in concert. And then finally, there's selected research listed at the end of each standard. We know that there's actually been purchases already, even though they've just been out one day with our standards book that's available in the Learning Forward bookstore to actually get the hard copy of the standards as well. So all of these materials that you're hearing about, and I'll be talking about in a moment about the tools, are available on our professional Standards for Professional Learning website. And that includes the video that you just saw as well. So quickly, we just wanted to highlight 2 of the resources, both the action guides and the innovation configuration maps that are available, both on the website and as PDFs for now, especially the action guides, because these are tools that were not available when the standards were last released in 2011. And as you see here, the power of action guides that are for across 7 roles, right? For the teacher, for the principal, for the instructional coach, for the district superintendent, for the system central office leader, like chief academic officer or equity officer, for the state commissioner or minister of education, and finally for external partners. All are available to think about deep implementation related to that role that's listed here. And so what's contained in this 8-page action guide are 3 things. 1, the actual standard statements, so that all 11 standards are there. Second, as you see there on the far my right, the key roles and responsibilities for each one of those roles related to each one of the frames. So what are the key roles and responsibilities for standards development and implementation? And then finally, there's a set of guiding questions so that each role can use those questions to think about taking first steps. Because we do know that any set of standards, it's challenging to think about deeper implementation and ownership. And we hope that these action guides that are free are available and will be used widely, specific to those 7 roles. Also, quickly wanted to mention our innovation configuration maps. Some of you are aware of them, they've used them in the past. And these also provide an excellent tool for those users and educators at all levels. As we affectionately call them, the IC maps are a list of detailed behaviors for each standard and the constructs within each standard, and provide a roadmap for educators at all levels to assess progress and quality of implementation. So what you see here, and these are available for purchase for the IC maps related to some of the action guides that you just saw, are based on a pretty simple operational level here. So first, thinking about what are the roles, since we have 4 IC maps related to central office, to principal, to coach, and external partner. So you would select a role first. Second, you would select the standard you would like to examine. And then third, you would select a construct, let's say within curriculum assessment and instruction standard. That will then take you to, as I mentioned, the levels of behaviors that you see here. We know there's a lot of text here on this slide, but the idea is that there are specific levels from basically novice all the way to that are highly effective and expert for each one of those constructs that are found in a specific standard. And we hope and have been used by educators at all levels to really map and determine future steps for systems and for teams and for individual educators. So we're really excited to share that these are available at the same time as the release of the standards. So again, a reminder that all these can be found on the Standards for Professional Learning website, and these tools, as well as the other ones that we are not showing examples for as well. So with that, I've talked a lot, talked too much probably, and ready to turn it over and excited to share again with our panelists here for a discussion around 4 different topics. So as I mentioned, we will have these topics around equity, high quality curriculum instructional materials, strict learning and school leadership, and excited to ask kind of the opening question that each of the panelists will share their thoughts with, and then we'll provide follow-up questions and discussion as well. So Amy, we get to start with you, and want to ask this kind of opening question about how do you see in your experience and in your expertise how the standards can advance equity and equity-based practices with those that you work with throughout, in your case, in the state of Michigan right now. So again, welcome.
Thank you, Paul. And I just want to say I'm extremely excited and honored to be a part of this momentous opportunity and a member of the panel. So thank you. I'm Amy Colton. I just realized that I've been a member of Learning Forward since the very first set of standards back in the 1980s. Probably some of my gray would indicate that. It's been exciting to experience over the decades the evolution of the standards and how equity has always been a part of them. I'm a former teacher for students with special needs, and currently I serve in 3 roles related to Learning Forward. I'm the executive director of Learning Forward Michigan, the state affiliate. I'm chair-elect of the Learning Forward Foundation, and our mission is to raise funds for scholarships and grant opportunities for educators to increase their knowledge, skills, and dispositions to further Learning Forward's vision for professional learning in their own context. And then I'm also a senior consultant. So obviously quite passionate about the role that professional learning can play. Before I share a few thoughts about the value of embedding equity in the newly revised professional learning standards, I want to pause and acknowledge Learning Forward's unrelenting commitment to equity and excellence. It takes courage and commitment, especially in the current times that we're living in, to speak up and out about the importance of equity in education, and I don't want that to go unnoticed. Like so many of you, I believe professional learning is the lever for change. Shirley Hord, a renowned researcher and also the one who was involved in creating innovation configurations, wrote, "All change is based on learning and improvement is based on change." Let me just say that one more time. All change is based on learning and improvement is based on change. The value of the standards in general is that they describe the essential elements needed to realize the full potential of professional learning. You might say it lays out the blueprint for how to create a professional learning system that leads to high outcomes for all students. However, I also believe it is only when equity is both called out explicitly and woven throughout all the standards that it is possible to attain transformational systems change. It is through educator actions and decisions that high-quality professional learning systems evolve. Therefore, educators need to develop the capacities revealed in the equity standards to dismantle system inequities and create policies, procedures, and practices that establish a collaborative, inclusive culture that supports quality learning opportunities for all teachers and all students, and that leads to educators understanding and applying inclusive practices to ensure all students have meaningful access to and participation in high-quality education to reach high outcomes. Over the last decade, my colleague and mentor, Virginia Winters, and I have engaged educators in professional learning to increase their cultural competence. We've experienced firsthand how complex and challenging diversity, inclusion, and equity work is in systems that were not developed for the kinds of professional learning described in these standards. In January of this year, Ginny and I were invited to co-facilitate a few sessions as part of a community of practice with students, state and province affiliate leaders, and Learning Forward Foundation board members. The purpose of the community of practice is to collaboratively deepen our understanding of how to enact the newly written 3 equity standards. What we discovered in a very short period of time and through a deep study of the standards is that the 3 do an excellent job in laying out the equity landscape as we understand it. The standards acknowledge that equity is both an outcome and an aspect of professional learning. Enacting all 3 in conjunction with the other 9 ensures that educator actions and decisions in establishing and sustaining high-quality professional learning are guided with an equity lens. In other words, equity, we're talking about equity as not a separate aspect of PL, but an integral part of it. The equity practice standard enlarges that the integral role that cultural competence, an outcome of professional learning, plays in the teaching and learning process. The equity drivers standard widens educators' examination of their social identities and how those interface in schools, classrooms, and the wider socio-political context. It is assumed that with the appropriate learning designs, educators will increase their knowledge of themselves and recognize the presence of patterns of privilege and power, historical biases, and institutional racism within their educational settings. This increased critical consciousness is a precursor to action. For the vision of professional learning described in these standards to come to fruition, educators must be committed to not only critical self-reflection, as described in the standards, of their own biases and beliefs. We call this the inside-out work. They must also recognize and be willing to dismantle system inequities that get in the way of creating high-quality professional learning for equitable outcomes, which gets me to the 3rd equity standard, which reminds us that increases in educator effectiveness and student learning is only possible when we, and this is a quote from the standard, establish high expectations, create structures to ensure equitable access to learning, and sustain a culture of support for all staff. This standard calls us, this is a call to action, my friends, to take a critical look at our current systems and be committed to transforming the policies, structures, and cultures that hinder collaboration and inclusivity. When all 3 equity standards are enacted in tandem with the other 9, systems transformation that leads to equal opportunities for high quality learning is possible. Thank you.
Oh, thanks so much, Amy. And powerful to hear you talk about the call to action, right, that you found in the standards. And as we know, has to really be part of, I think, every system, especially to advance equity and equitable outcomes. And as you said, in an integrated fashion and not as a standalone, as we know, equity is not a program, it's not a separate approach, but rather it's both an outcome and an aspect. So really appreciate your thinking and thoughts and your experience working with different groups, especially across the state. And I think that's a nice lead in, Eric. You know, you have I think the good fortune of working nationally and seeing this across the country that also has an equity aspect, right? With, we know that high quality curriculum and instructional materials also is very much an equity issue in terms of the inequities that can exist. So want to hear from your perspective and your expertise, how you believe the standards can also advance the important work around curriculum and instructional materials right now. So thanks and welcome again, Eric.
Oh, thank you, Paul, and absolutely see the availability of high quality instructional materials as an equity issue and as a way to ensure all students in all classrooms have access to rigorous content that's grade level, engaging, meaningful, and affirming to all students. And the scope and sequence in high quality instructional materials and the professional learning that is necessary for it to happen is critical to that. And I'm not sure that I have the longest tenure, since I did not start with Learning Forward and standards in the 1980s. But this was my second go around with Learning Forward standards. And I got to be on the original panel that did the first set of revisions to the original standards that were published in 2001. And it just has made me reflect on how things have changed. Obviously, my son, who was born that year, is now an adult, although he reminds me on several occasions, not necessarily completely as a 21-year-old. And even back since 2011, how state standards have evolved, how research has evolved, and how the instructional materials marketplace has evolved. And when we created these standards, the emphasis was really on the how, the systems, and the resources necessary. And even on the content standards, they were much more focused on equity as content, quality teaching, and family involvement. They weren't focused on the content and the what of what teachers are teaching, which is largely found in the instructional core. And it is so fantastic as we look at this revision of the Learning Forward standards, and as we look at the rigorous content for each learner, how the instructional core is front and center in that. Because in the end, we know schools are about kids and teachers and conveying content to those learners, and that is done directly with students through high quality instructional materials and indirectly. And so to have that in the instructional core and high quality instructional materials as one of the standards now, and to really focus in on the what, is fantastic. And since 2011, my group Ed Reports started around 2015 reviewing instructional materials. And when we launched with our first reviews in K-8 in mathematics, we sadly found only one set of materials fully met the content alignment to rigorous college and career standards, and supported teachers with the kinds of instructional changes necessary to really make those standards come alive for kids. Since that time, however, so fast forward to now, we've reviewed over 1,000 grade and course level materials in math, ELA, and science, and fully 40% of the materials we've reviewed in math have the right math in the right doses and the right time to support students and teachers in ensuring grade level standards are taught and experienced in engaging ways by kids. And about half of the ELA materials that we have reviewed fully met our alignment criteria. So again, it wasn't the case the last time the standards were created, perhaps that the instructional materials could bear that weight of the strong professional learning that teachers need, but that certainly is the case now. There's options. And we see that in research. Over the past decade, since the last standards were put out, we've seen studies that show the difference between teachers using high quality instructional materials in middle school math, for example, that there was a difference and a gain of 3.6 percentile points, which is roughly the equivalent of having a new teacher versus a third-year teacher. And Paul, as you mentioned, sadly, we know what happens when teachers don't have access to high quality instructional materials. They need to spend 7 to 12 hours on average per week, often going to Google, Pinterest, and uncurated sites in search of materials and try to piece it day to day, which raises huge equity concerns. And we saw with research from TNTP and the opportunity myth that oftentimes teachers with the best of intentions not only lose that time, but have a tough time ensuring that teachers are really getting grade level content that is so important to college and career success. And they found 571 out of 800 hours of instruction were off grade level, and that was much more likely to occur without districts providing high quality instructional materials and teachers trying to piece it together themselves. Sadly, we know that professional learning that is available right now is not connected sufficiently to high quality instructional materials. Nearly a third of teachers report that they have access to less than 5 hours of curriculum-related professional learning per year. And a quarter of teachers say they have absolutely no access and no learning that's tied to their curriculum. But we know for curriculum to be implemented with integrity, notice I did not say fidelity, with integrity, so we can take advantage of the scope and sequence and use the curriculum to have teachers teach the students that they have, that we really need to focus in on that professional learning, tie it to the materials, and then connect it to the other areas of the standards.
Yeah. Thank you, Eric. And again, it's struck by the importance and the equity through line, right, of what Amy you were sharing, and also Eric as well. And also, as you mentioned, Eric, the 1-2 punch, right, of high quality instructional materials and content-based professional learning, and the importance of coupling those two together, because every educator, again, deserves it, should be demanding it, and should be experiencing it in order to really grow and develop and feel supported. We're going to come back to that theme in a moment about the reality, right? And sometimes when teachers don't have access, what are the strategies? But I want to turn to Tara. Thank you for, in your role in all the great work in Jefferson County and Louisville. How do you align and think about, right, a systems approach at the district level when you're talking about professional learning that sometimes, frankly, can feel more like, a lot of bright ornaments on the tree rather than bundling everything together in a coherent systems approach? And you've actually walked the walk and done that. So I'd love to hear your thinking about the revised standards and how that can really perpetuate and sustain a systems approach. And welcome, Tara. Well, I think you're on mute there.
Thank you very much, Paul. And it's great to listen to the different guests here today to find out how they're approaching the standards. It's giving me some ideas. And listening to them, it has just brought up so many different things. Whether you're new to the Learning Forward standards or whether this is a second round for you or third round, I have to say it's one of the most powerful learning that's taking place across our country today, and even the world for that matter. What a great question that Paul started off with is, how we use these learning designs. First and foremost, I do want to just say that digging into district strategic planning and then looking at learning designs, it's important to drill down and find out what that system is really about. And so, just for the sake of being that practitioner, I wanted to just share that there's been a whole lot of marking up, reading, and just getting very clear on what do words mean in the standards so that it's clear when I'm having a conversation with people that I work with closely or looking at how to make a change with someone's problem of practice, that we're very clear on understanding what is meant. And I cannot draw enough attention to the beginning of every section of the standards, and especially with learning designs, there's a statement that aligns everything that's done within the organization and then the specifics of that standard. So just for the sake of keeping everyone on the same page, I'll read this brief statement. Professional learning results in equitable and excellent professional learning results in equitable and excellent outcomes for all students. And here's where my part comes in today. When educators set relevant and contextualized learning goals, ground their work in research and theories about learning, and implement evidence-based learning designs. So the first section talking about setting relevant and contextualized learning, it's very important whether you're looking at adult learning or you're looking at student learning, that you're always trying to find a frame of reference of where we are and where we plan to go and how that learner fits into it. A great teacher is always looking at where that person is. And the historic pieces around that person's life and culture are also extremely relevant. Grounding your work in research and learning theories, I cannot say enough about the amount of research that has gone into every standard. If you drill down into the action guides to find out about not only what that standard means, but case studies, specific articles, but things that are rooted in research and that you're not just trying something without knowing the history behind it. And then the last piece, which I'll touch on a little bit, is the importance of the evidence-based learning. It's always good when you rally around a practice or a design, but when you have an actual practice that you can see with certainty the effect size or the percentage of how this is impacting learning in the long run. I cannot say enough about that. So jumping right back into this, one of the things in Jefferson County that we were afforded was we spent some time with Learning Forward at the Academy. And so a lot of the thinking that we came back and applied into our work had to deal with identifying a problem of practice. And then as the standard talks about, we looked at a theory of action based on something that someone had proven, had tried, had done, and looking at what that outcome was that we wanted to produce, and then seeing if we could find relevant research out there that would help us make that statement or that goal to set. And then part of that moved into the implementation part. We knew what kind of goals that we had or we wanted to achieve, but we were always, and we had ideas, but then we had to take a closer look at the evidence-based practices. And I will pause for a second in my story to just shout out to Learning Forward that in this iteration of the Learning Forward standards, there are such specifics. Even before you get to the action guide, you have on page 46, for those of you who are following along, just some evidence-based learning designs that are right in front of you with an idea or short statement about it, such as immersive learning experiences, book studies, and how that helps the learner access learning at their own pace, co-teaching, expert coaching and mentoring, non-evaluative peer and mentoring support. But these are action items that can be very helpful when you're planning that design and that implementation piece. And I'll say right there in Jefferson County, one of the things that we pulled together, and there's a history about our district and why we became so interested with Learning Forward, is we realized that we had a lot of great ideas and a lot of talent, but we were not really honing in on the intentionality of that implementation plan to really look at setting goals that had initial outcomes, intermediate outcomes, so that we could look and see how we were doing with reaching our goal. And the other piece that came about through looking at this learning design is looking at that evaluation of impact. Paul referred to you earlier in the message about the IC maps, the innovation configuration maps. And it has been such an aha for many educators in our district and some professional learning communities working in teams. Having that innovation configuration map as you're talking through a problem of practice, it was very helpful to them to look at those descriptors and looking at where they were as a unit. And if they wanted to work on a specific piece in the learning design, finding that language that they would need to do, whether they were trying to improve something personally in their professional growth plan, as a team, as a school, and even onto the district planning, which we are now looking at a district level, looking at a design, our learning design plan with our district professional learning plan. So I cannot say enough about the innovation configuration map being a place where you can look at the work to kind of root into that standard and really tease out what would be iterations or steps to move towards that goal that you're working towards. And some specifics about that that I'd like to mention. And we really took this practice into looking at our new teacher retention. And this is prior to the last 2 years. But we were looking at how we could help support new teachers in our district so that they would we would have a higher retention rate. And with the help of my colleagues on my team, we moved from the 87th percent to 90. It was 87 to 96% within 2 years of really embracing the learning design pieces and doing a deep dive within the standards to help provide us with that structure of how we were setting goals, looking at implementation, and then evaluating for impact. The second piece that we're looking at and continuing on this growth is that we're looking at our national board certified teachers. We're looking at what they bring to the table, and then how are they impacting students. Specifically, we're looking at recruitment of high quality teachers of color, and we're also looking at the impact of if we were mentoring, what is our retention rate when we're looking at equity across our district, whether it's recruitment for national board, whether it's recruitment of mentoring, whether it's recruitment of seasoned veteran teachers to work with teachers, and do new teachers turn to mentoring opportunities after. We really could talk about this quite a while. I'll sum up today with talking about that learning design, and especially the standards, taking a deep look into it and spending that time affords you with an opportunity to not only ground your work in the processes, the research, and that you have evidence-based practices. And it goes without saying, there's always articles and references at the very end of every standard that points you to if you want to take a deeper dive. And I hope this is not something that I'm prepared to say, but there has never been a time where I've not been able to contact someone at Learning Forward and ask for assistance if I've been stuck. And part of that partnership that they so graciously give led to also being aware of the standards assessment inventory, which is absolutely huge. And I cannot wait to dig into finding out about teachers' perceptions about learning designs so that we can look at our model to see if there are ways that we can incorporate voices of how they feel that we should move this programming forward and to enforce that agency. And I guess I'll close it out with saying that learning designs is part of, I would say, not only our learning system, but it is the conduit of our learning system. And the standards, each of them have an equal weight and a value and a time and a place for where they are stepping forward and working together. But I have the pleasure of talking about strategic planning and learning designs, and cannot, I use it on a daily basis in the educational realm, but it is so relevant to personal goal setting as well. I think it's probably one of our jewels for this time in history.
That's great. Thank you, Tara, and especially all the examples you gave of learning designs in Jefferson County that derive these kind of continuous improvement cycles that it sounds like a lot of the educators are engaged in, really to improve better outcomes for teacher practice and for students. So I'm really excited to hear that. And thank you for also mentioning tools like the IC maps and the standards assessment inventory that is being revised and will be available soon. That's aligned to the revised standards. So with all that, Marlon, now we would turn to you, and excited at the school level, having myself been a former high school principal, we know how important leadership is at the school level, and also with the standards has the leadership standard. But we also know you're not doing this alone, right? In thinking about how you build capacity and shared leadership. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about how you could see the standards as a tool for driving all kinds of educator support and growth in the school setting that you're in. So, again, welcome.
Well, I want to say first, I'm so excited to be on this panel and just see the way in which everybody's engaged in this work. And it's easy at the school level to, you're there in the trenches. And so sometimes it's very easy at the school level to not see the big picture and see people at different levels looking at it from the 30,000 feet, looking at it from the research, looking at it from the district level, and seeing how your work impacts what happens in the classroom on a random Tuesday. It's exciting. It's exciting to see how broad the work is and to hear the passion in everyone's voice for making sure every day, every child has an amazing learning experience that's transformational. And so at the school level, when I look at the standards, for me personally, the first thought that popped in my mind is that school is not a monolithic place. And the great thing about the standards is the wealth of information that's actionalized in the standards. So you're not just given an encyclopedia of PD stuff, but really the idea of having action guides and sort of a blueprint for implementation. I'm in my 7th year as a principal, and I'm thinking about my first year colleagues and all the support that you can put around them, because as I said, school is not monolithic. So I'm engaging seasoned educators, and I'm engaging first-year teachers, and I'm engaging people in the middle of their journey, and I'm engaging new school leaders. And all of these moving pieces are the parts that I'm trying to make that systematic professional learning that Paul was talking about. And so the wheels that make my system turn are not monolithic. They're changing and they're moving. And so to be able to root that and ground that in a time-tested rubric for learning and a guide that has really jumped into today. Like I think about my learning as a school leader, and wow, it was about 2011. We really think about this idea that there are terms we're using today that weren't on the landscape. I mean, yeah, equity was the work, but the way that we've zeroed in and gotten granular about how that should impact every classroom every day. The idea that in Jefferson County and in the Midwest and in California, we have the ability to use comparable language and be able to glean promising practices and bring them to the table as a new school leader, as a seasoned school leader who's looking to make shifts. I really think this could be a high leverage tool to do that, to have a way to engage in that dialogue and to speak at the district level, and then come into a 6th grade science classroom and be able to talk about what are some of those things that I can bring equity to the forefront, and even the semantics that were chosen as we work through the process, the idea of talking about something as conditions for success, and just begin to speak about transformational processes. Those are things that we can create the kind of big tent movement that impact every classroom. Like I was really excited as Eric was talking to hear, thinking of an idea from 2001 through the mid-2000s, you're moving from 0% of the curriculums having some materials to come to 40%. This is the type of tool that we can move close to the day that we're all looking for, where we can really look at 100% of schools, really having these challenging discussions. I mean, we have to remember that we're asking that teacher in the classroom, or let me take it to my level and personalize it, we're asking that principal to actively engage in discomfort, to do what's necessary to create an equitable classroom where every child has a rich, deep learning experience. And so the more tools you can put, the more support we can put around them, it's courageous work. And I think this is some great work that's gone into this. Like I'm really excited about the action guides. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking about my earliest work as a principal, and I wish I had an action guide in hand as I was working with teacher leaders and they were asking me questions that I didn't yet have the vocabulary to articulate. And so this is a great piece to support that.
That's great. Yeah, thank you, Principal Williams, and I especially appreciate the shout out for the action guides, because by design, as you said, I don't know, I wish I had it as a first year principal, especially. But also that the first steps part of the action guide is really to say, like, you know, what do you need in your middle school? Because we know that's different, right, than a rural elementary school, which is different from a suburban high school. And so the point was not to say you follow the learning forward steps. It's what are your own steps, you know, relevant and customizable to your environment. And that's, we hope that action guides will really serve that.
And there's something I actually love. It's that it's, like I said, it's not monolithic. It's not a cookie cutter. It's not, this is the 5 steps to success, but how do we make this our own? And how do we look at it from our community and ask ourselves difficult questions?
Yeah, exactly.
And experience discomfort. You know, I think it's important, it's significant.
Thank you for your leadership. And so I know we have just a few minutes remaining, but I especially a joint question maybe for Amy and Eric about, I mean, it's really relevant for all of you, but if you think about the classroom teacher experience, you know, and let's say they're in a place right now that they don't have access to high quality instructional materials and they're trying to navigate equity. That's a tough spot, as Amy, you mentioned in the beginning. Any quick thoughts about, you know, how to support educators in that, find themselves in that spot, because we know that's the reality, can be, right? Both on the material side and on the practices side, where they might be getting pushed back around.
On the materials side, first off, even when teachers do have access to high quality instructional materials, oftentimes they're either not engaged in the selection process or don't really engage to understand why it's HQIM. So the first piece is use the materials you have if they are of quality. We hear from teachers that the materials may not be engaging, that they feel that this is something to follow in lockstep, as opposed to knowing that strong professional learning, as in the Learning Forward standards, really helps them unleash those things. So the first thing, if you have them, use them. If you don't have them, I hope tools like Ed Reports, I hope like the Learning Forward standards, and the kind of investigation with tools to really build curriculum literacy, understand where there may be deficiencies in their material, and think how they may be able to supplement and utilize them. Because again, teachers don't teach the materials. Day-to-day is scripted out of the box. They teach it with integrity, keeping the scope and sequence, using a resource as makes sense for the kids in front of them. And lastly, if you don't have those materials, advocate. Ultimately, right now, there are free materials. Use that curriculum literacy from looking at our tool, which goes into detail with hundreds of pages of evidence guides on top of our criteria as to why these materials are high quality, that they can start to use this not only on their own materials, but looking at resources out there, but that's temporary. With ESSER funding, with following the standards from districts, there is a need for districts to provide this for teachers, and teachers need to get out there and just ask for it and engage great principals like Marlon in advocating alongside them.
Great, thank you.
I was going to add that we need to clone Marlon,
no, right?
because so much of what we're talking about depends on the leadership. And that being said, over the years, one of the things that I found is sometimes we have to start small. Sometimes we want to go in and we want to change the system big time. And I think some of the most successful professional learning experiences I was involved in is where a few teachers got together, engaged in the collaborative inquiry, built the trusting relationships they need to ask probing questions, take risks, experiment with things, that it's not always the most helpful to start big. And then what typically happens is as some small teams start seeing success, others start going like, what are they doing differently? And what might we need to do? And sometimes it grows from the inside out. And the other is that, and I think it came up earlier about teachers are going to identify and do it all the time, even if there isn't a structure, what the things are they're struggling with. And that's the place to start. Let's get together. Let's talk about those problems of practice, and let's build what we need to, the structures, conditions, processes, find the materials that we need to really transform our practice and the systems in which we're working.
Great. Well, again, thank you. And we are right at time. I wish we could continue, but I really want to thank all four of you. Please note for audience, this is being recorded, so this will be available right away on the Learning Forward website. So if we hope there may be opportunities to use this in future settings as well with your teams and with your systems. But again, a huge thank you to all four of you because of the powerful experiences and expertise you've shared. I want to just mention again, as we're closing, we hope that everybody comes back tomorrow, because as you'll see for the rest of the schedule, we have the congressional hearing, the congressional briefing tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern, followed also again by Thursday's session on the different roles, and then finally Friday with the Research Foundation. So all that's happening for the rest of the week. We hope you join us. Thank you so much again for joining today, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.